The Mechanic and the Stranger. The air on Nexus 9 was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and scorched circuitry, an unrelenting reminder of the world's industrial past. The sun, a strange orange hue in the sky, beat down relentlessly on the barren landscape. It was a world forgotten by time, a world whose once thriving cities had long since crumbled into dust, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of machines and buildings. A wasteland where debris was the only thing left to signify that life had once existed here. David Hartman knew this place well. He had made it his home, a haven for the lost and the discarded. David wasn't just a survivor. He was a mechanic, someone who could fix anything, from the most intricate pieces of alien technology to the simplest of machines. The years he had spent on Nexus 9 had hardened him in ways he hadn't thought possible, but he had learned to adapt, to use the wreckage around him to carve out a life in the harshest of conditions. Every day was a battle, against the elements, against the alien factions who controlled what little infrastructure remained, and sometimes against his own loneliness. Today, however, he felt something different, a shift in the air. It was subtle, like the first gust of wind before a storm. He was working on a battered transport ship, pulling apart its engine piece by piece, trying to salvage what little could be used for repairs. His fingers were stained with oil and grime, his body sore from hours of hard labor. His armor, which had once gleamed with the pride of a soldier, now looked like an old relic, weathered and worn from years of use. But it still served him well, protecting him from the brutal heat and the occasional skirmishes with the dangerous wildlife of Nexus 9. His plasma torch flickered as he moved it over a stubborn section of the engine. Sparks flew, briefly illuminating the darkened scrapyard before they fell into darkness once again. Nexus 9 had no proper sunlight, only harsh, artificial lighting that flickered at random intervals. The scrapyard itself seemed endless, a maze of twisted metal and broken machinery that stretched out before him like a labyrinth. Every corner hid something new. An ancient war machine, the skeletal remains of a crashed spaceship, the forgotten ruins of alien cities. The wasteland felt alive in its own twisted way, a reminder of what had been. As David worked, his mind wandered. He thought about Earth, the home he had once known, a planet now lost to history. He remembered the friends he had left behind, the comrades who had fought beside him during the wars. But that was before the Great Conflict, before the fall of humanity's grand empire. Earth had been reduced to ashes, and Nexus 9 was now his new reality. A reality of survival, where every day was a struggle to hold on to something resembling a normal life. But then, amidst the quiet hum of his tools, something caught his eye. A flash of white against the rusted backdrop of the scrapyard. A figure moving with fluid grace, though it seemed out of place in the harsh landscape. David squinted, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. At first, he thought it was just another mirage, his mind playing tricks on him after too many long days under the blistering sun. But no, the figure was real. It was a woman. She was unlike any he had ever seen before. Her skin was as pale as moonlight, almost luminescent in the dimming light. Her hair shimmered silver, long and flowing, like a waterfall of metal. She was an alien, one of the Austrians, a species David had encountered a few times during his time on Nexus 9. They were known for their elegance, their quiet strength, and their ability to adapt to the harsh conditions of the planet. But this woman, this alien, was different. There was a weariness in her movements, a heaviness in her step that didn't belong. David watched as she moved slowly through the wreckage, her eyes scanning the piles of metal debris, her delicate hands brushing against the cold steel as if searching for something. She looked lost, and for the first time in a long time, David felt a pang of sympathy. He had seen many people, both human and alien, struggle to survive on Nexus 9, but this woman's sorrow was palpable. Something had broken her. His heart clenched, and without thinking, he called out to her, "You all right down there?" The woman froze, her head snapping up at the sound of his voice. For a moment, she seemed like she was ready to flee, her eyes wide with fear. Then, as though recognizing him, something shifted in her expression. Her body relaxed just slightly, but the fear never fully left her eyes. She spoke, her voice soft and melodic, with a hint of trembling. "The human mechanic," she said, as if confirming her own thoughts. Her words were delicate, but there was an underlying tremor in her tone, a vulnerability David had never expected from someone of her kind. David made his way down the slope of scrap metal, carefully navigating the piles of debris. His boots crunched against the rusted surface, and he moved with a quiet confidence, a habit formed from years of navigating the chaotic landscape of Nexus 9. When he reached the bottom, he stopped a few feet away from her, studying her carefully. "Are you all right?" he repeated, his voice softer now. "You don't look well." The woman flinched, but then she steadied herself, meeting his gaze. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the words didn't match the look in her eyes. She hugged herself as if trying to shield her fragile form from something invisible, something that had wounded her deeply. The rags she wore clung to her slender frame, barely offering any protection against the elements. She had once carried herself with pride, but now she was a shadow of that confident person. David frowned, his mind racing. He had heard rumors of the Austrians, their delicate skin, their sensitivity to the radiation that bathed Nexus 9. He had seen them avoid the sunlight, staying under the shelter of buildings or beneath the shadows cast by the wreckage. But he had never seen one so vulnerable, so exposed. He knew something had happened to her, something that had left her stranded in this place with nowhere to turn. "They took everything," she finally murmured, her voice barely audible. "The housing authority. I missed 2 payments, and they threw me out." She gestured helplessly at her tattered state, as if the words themselves were too much for her to bear. "My species, we can't survive out here. Our skin burns easily. We need protection." David's heart sank as he listened to her words. The housing authority on Nexus 9 was notorious for its ruthless policies, but he hadn't imagined they would go so far. To throw someone out like this, to leave them to fend for themselves in a world so harsh, he couldn't stand it. And yet, he knew what he had to do. There was no choice but to help. Without another word, David turned and began moving toward the scrap piles, his mind already calculating how he could make this right. "How tall are you?" he called over his shoulder, already pulling pieces of metal from the piles. The woman blinked, clearly confused. "About 6 feet, she answered hesitantly. David didn't respond immediately. He was too busy working, selecting the best materials he could find. His hands moved with practiced precision, pulling sheets of metal, thick, blue-tinted alloy that had once been used for Jovian colony ships. The metal would make the perfect shelter, tough, resistant to radiation, and durable enough to withstand the harsh conditions. He could build her a home, a safe place. He turned to her, his expression softening. "Help me gather these panels," he said. "We'll build you a shelter." The woman stared at him for a moment, her silver eyes wide with disbelief. You would do this for me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. David smiled, his hands already moving to arrange the metal sheets. "Because I can," he said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." And so they began to work. The hours passed quickly, filled with the sound of welding and the hum of tools. David led her through the process, teaching her how to handle the materials and helping her piece together a shelter that would offer her protection from the sun and the dangers of Nexus 9. As the sun began to set, the shelter took shape, a small functional structure, sturdy and safe, even if it wasn't much to look at. David stepped back, surveying their work. "It's not much," he said with a shrug, "but it'll keep you safe." The woman, Linnea, he had learned, stood in silence, her wide eyes taking in the sight of her new home. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." David didn't respond at first. He was too busy thinking about the work ahead, the repairs he had to make tomorrow. But as he turned to leave, Lenya's voice stopped him. "Will you come back to check on it?" she asked, her voice full of quiet hope. David paused at the doorway of the shelter, looking back at her. The last rays of sunlight caught in her silver hair, making her look almost ethereal. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'll come back." And with that, he walked away, leaving Lenya in her new home, a place that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it could be a refuge, a home built from scraps. As the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky, David Hartman made his way back across the wrecked landscape of Nexus 9, his mind still reeling from the unexpected encounter with Lenya. The weight of the day's work pressed down on him, yet something about it felt different. He had built many things in his time, from makeshift shelters to complex machines, but he had never built a home for someone like this before, and certainly not for someone who wasn't human. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had made a difference, that for once, his skills had been used not for survival but for something more meaningful. The scrapyard around him had fallen silent as the planet's artificial night cycle took over, the constant hum of power grids and machinery temporarily subsiding into a low mechanical buzz. A few scattered sparks flickered in the distance, where other scavengers worked late into the night, dismantling forgotten relics of a lost age. David didn't pay them much mind. He wasn't interested in the scrap for profit or trade. His hands were often too busy mending what was broken. His thoughts were focused on the shelter, on Lenya. What had driven her to such a desperate point? He could only imagine the kind of life she had led, navigating a world that seemed hostile to everything about her species. From the moment she had arrived on Nexus 9, she must have learned to survive in ways that most would consider unimaginable. But now she had something to call her own, a tiny haven in the midst of the wasteland, and David couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for it, for her. The sound of his boots crunching against the metal debris was the only noise that filled the night as he moved towards his workshop. It wasn't much, just a small, half-collapsed structure filled with tools and materials he had scavenged over the years, but it was his space, his sanctuary. Here, he could escape from the chaos of the world and immerse himself in the art of fixing and building. His sanctuary was just as much a part of him as the tools he used. It was a refuge in a place that offered little solace. But tonight, as he stepped inside and began to remove his armor, David couldn't shake the thought of Lenya. He could still see the way she had looked at the shelter, her silver eyes wide in disbelief, her voice barely a whisper of gratitude. It wasn't the kind of thank you he was used to hearing. It wasn't forced, wasn't the polite thank you of a stranger. It was heartfelt, raw, and full of emotions David wasn't sure how to process. The whole encounter felt surreal, almost like a dream he couldn't fully grasp. "Get a grip, Hartman," he muttered to himself as he placed his gear on the worn workbench. "She needed help, and you gave it. That's all." But it wasn't just about helping her. It was more than that. He realized he had become attached to the idea of making things right, of creating something that could be useful to someone who had nowhere else to go. There was something profoundly human about it. In a galaxy filled with conflict and alien species, human ingenuity was often overlooked. But David knew better. He had seen what humanity was capable of, not just in the midst of war, but in the quiet moments when people reached out to one another, when they helped simply because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, as the twin moons of Nexus 9 rose above the horizon, David found himself waking earlier than usual. His mind was already buzzing with thoughts of the shelter, of the work he had to do to ensure it was truly a safe place for Lenya. The night had been uneventful, but the day ahead promised to be full of challenges. After all, even the most basic of shelters in a place like Nexus 9 required constant maintenance, especially with the unpredictable weather patterns and the ever-present danger of radiation spikes. David suited up, donning his weathered combat armor, and made his way back to the scrapyard. The landscape seemed almost peaceful in the early morning light, the familiar ruins taking on a different character with the soft glow of dawn. He walked with purpose, knowing what he had to do. As he approached the area where he had left Linnea, his thoughts wandered to her situation. Building trust in the wasteland. Days turned into weeks, and the world of Nexus 9, harsh and unforgiving as it was, began to feel a little less oppressive for David. His routine remained much the same: salvaging parts, repairing machines, and keeping the scrapyard in check. But his life had taken a quiet turn, with Linnea now a part of it. The shelter he had built for her was more than just a refuge from the radiation and harsh sunlight. It had become a symbol of something deeper. It was a place where both of them could pause, regroup, and find some semblance of stability in the chaos. David was never one to get too attached. He had learned the hard way that bonds could be fragile in a world where survival often came first. But Linnea was different. There was something about her quiet strength, the way she moved through the world with a grace that belied the harshness of Nexus 9. She was a survivor in her own right, but she had never asked for help. The offer had come from David, an unexpected gesture in a place where no one expected kindness. And yet, she accepted it. Over time, the walls between them began to lower, brick by brick, much like the structure they were building together. Every morning, David would arrive at the shelter, his tools slung over his shoulder and his mind set on the tasks ahead. Linnea, though her past weighed heavily on her, had started to find purpose in helping him with repairs. She was quick to learn, picking up the skills she would need to maintain her new home. Her hands, once delicate and fragile, now worked with precision and skill, crafting the pieces of her own future with each twist of a wrench or cut through metal. Their days were spent in silence for the most part, with only the sounds of welding, grinding, and the occasional hum of a generator filling the air. The work was tiring, but it was necessary, and it kept them both focused. Nexus 9 was never a quiet planet. It was alive with the hum of old machines and the constant threat of danger. Even in the shelter, the sound of the wind rattling against the metal walls reminded them that no place was truly safe. But still, the small space was a sanctuary, and each day they worked to make it more secure, more livable. Linnea's presence, though initially a mystery to David, had started to make more sense. She was no longer just an alien in need of help. She was someone with a history, with a story that had yet to be fully told. But she wasn't ready to share it yet, and David didn't press. They had all the time in the world, and as they worked side by side, there were moments when she seemed to relax, when the sadness in her eyes faded for just a second, replaced by a glimmer of something else. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the scrapyard, David sat back on his heels, surveying their work. The shelter now had reinforced walls, a sturdier roof, and a functional ventilation system. It wasn't much, but it was more than anything else in the barren landscape of Nexus 9. The two of them had made it their own, slowly transforming the pile of scraps into something that could hold up against the elements. Linnea stood nearby, wiping the sweat from her brow as she examined a newly installed solar panel that David had scavenged from an old colony ship. Her silver eyes caught the last rays of the sun, and for a brief moment she looked almost ethereal against the backdrop of the fading light. David noticed the way she moved, her every step graceful despite the weariness that still clung to her. There was a kind of quiet strength in her, an enduring resilience that had gotten her this far in a world that had shown little mercy to her kind. "You're really good at this," Linnea said, her voice carrying a note of awe. She had become more comfortable speaking to him over the weeks, and David could sense that she was beginning to trust him in ways she hadn't before. It was subtle, the way she would linger for a moment longer when speaking to him, the way her eyes met his when she was working by his side. It was as if she was starting to understand the depth of what he had done for her, building the shelter, offering her a place to stay, and what it meant to have someone care, even for a short while. David gave a half smile, wiping his hands on his work pants. "It's just what I do. It's not pretty, but it works." He paused, leaning against the wall of the shelter as he looked out across the scrapyard. You'll be able to fix this place up yourself soon enough. I've shown you the basics. You've got the knack for it." Lania nodded, her silver hair catching the light in a way that made her look almost angelic. "I never thought I would be here," she said, her voice a whisper against the soft rustling of the wind. "Never thought I would be living in a place like this. We had our cities, our homes. Everything was so different back on my world." David turned to face her, sensing the weight behind her words. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gentle, though he already knew it wouldn't be an easy answer. Lania hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering to the ground. The look in her eyes was a mix of sorrow and fear, like someone who had faced too many battles, both external and internal. "The war," she said quietly. "It destroyed everything. My people were once great, with technology beyond even what you humans have achieved. But it wasn't enough. The war took everything from us." David didn't press her further. He could see that she wasn't ready to tell him everything, and he respected that. Sometimes it was enough just to be there, to listen, to offer help when it was needed. And David had never been one to push. He knew what it was like to carry burdens alone. He had spent years running from his past, from the memories of the war on Earth that had shaped him into the man he was today. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. The evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the landscape. David knew that for all their hard work, there was still more to do. The shelter was functional, yes, but it wasn't finished. There were always more repairs to make, more improvements to consider. And there was always the looming threat of the world outside, of the alien factions, the scavengers, and the harsh environment of Nexus 9. But as he looked at Lania, standing there in the fading light, something inside him stirred. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about rebuilding, not just the shelter, but their lives. Two broken souls, each with their own history, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to have forgotten them. And perhaps together, they could create something that would endure, something more than just the sum of its parts. The wind picked up again, a gust of cold air that swept through the scrapyard, rattling the metal walls of their shelter. David glanced up at the sky, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening expanse. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, breaking the silence. "We've still got work to do." Lania nodded, offering him a soft smile. "I'll be here." And with that, David turned to leave, his mind already racing with ideas for what they could build next. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't just about surviving, but about creating something worth protecting.